Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight for Climate Momentum, the things that keep me cheerful in the face of the worst problem ever. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am currently on the territory of the unceded sacred homeland of the Lenape people who have stewarded this land throughout generations. My name is Elisa Petrosova, and I am the co-founder of the Cooper Climate Coalition, as well as Cooper Union Climate Week. And I am an alumna. Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight for Climate Momentum, for the things that keep me cheerful. Sorry. Cooper Union Climate Week 2021, our third official Climate Week, is a series of lectures and events that aim to engage our community in assessing the role of the climate crisis in our day-to-day lives. This year, we focused on the themes of reconstruction and deconstruction as we imagine all the work ahead of us. The Cooper Climate Coalition aims to promote curiosity, interdisciplinary dialogue, and sustained engagement with the climate crisis. Today, I have the honor and privilege of introducing Rebecca Solnit, whose empathy, care, humor, and vulnerability has inspired me to keep going on my darkest days. Writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and Indigenous history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and disaster, including Whose Story Is This? Hope in the Dark, Men Explain Things to Me, that Cooper was proud to have hosted a 10th anniversary celebration of its publication in our Great Hall with Rebecca in 2018, and many more. She also co-created the and received a Guggenheim, the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, and the Lannan Literary Award for River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge, and the Technological Wild West. Her latest book, Recollections of My Nonexistence, was released in March 2020. A product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school, she is a columnist who writes about climate, feminism, and other issues at The Guardian and is a regular contributor to Literary Hub. She is on the board of Oil Change International, where we work to expose the true costs of fossil fuels and facilitate the ongoing transition to clean energy, and is on the advisory board of Dayenu, the Jewish climate group. We hope you'll also join us tomorrow for a conversation with Ken Liu and Karen Lord entitled Unfolding Futures. Without further ado, I pass it on to Rebecca Solnit.
Good afternoon from the unceded ancestral land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, also known as San Francisco. And thank you everyone who's joined us. Thank you for coming to hear me. Thank you for caring about climate, which is why I assume you've come. And let me start by saying that the acknowledgements my lovely introducer and I just did were really rare if they were happening at all 10 years ago. 30 years ago, a lot of settler people in the United States, who we didn't call settler people then, thought that Native people had somehow vanished and tended to speak about them in the past tense as people who are not possibly part of the conversation. We settlers, by design, knew very little about indigenous people. By design, I mean that a kind of cultural genocide rendered Native people invisible as individuals, cultures, and nations present on this continent, which of course means their knowledge and rights were also largely invisible to the mainstream, including land management practices that might have prevented a lot of the recent Western wildfires. I watched a transformation, the rise of visibility, the recovery of rights, languages, cultural pride, being counted by the census, political power, engagement with environmental groups that transformed the environmental movement. It was a remarkable process. Though far from perfect or complete even now, watching it in the early 90s was what convinced me that culture mattered, that culture is a substrata for which politics is a shallow surface, that ideas matter, and further, that valuable, influential ideas often begin in the shadows and margins and move towards the center, and the center rarely knows this, that people usually regarded as insignificant, if they are regarded at all, can change the world and often have or do. And as a great example of this, I want to cite a report that came out late last month that said Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions. That is so huge. And until somebody decided to go look for it and quantify it, a number of groups, including the Indigenous Environmental Network and my own Oil Change International, it had never been quantified. 1/4, that is so much power. People who we were people consigned to the long ago past are leading us into the best possible version of the future. These are people who already lived through the end of their world when their lands were stolen, their populations decimated, and colonial domination disrupted their lives and culture in every possible way. I'm not saying Native people will do our work for us, but I am saying that there are people who persisted through one kind of devastation who are now leaders in responding to another kind. From the Line 3 pipeline fight in Minnesota right now, to the many campaigns against pipelines in Western Canada, to Standing Rock and beyond. The world as we know it is coming to an end, and how it ends is up to us right now. This is what we will decide in this decade. It's the end of the age of fossil fuel, but if the fossil fuel corporations have their way, the ending will be delayed as long as possible, with as much carbon burned as possible and as much damage inflicted as possible. If we have our way, we radically reduce our use of those fuels by 2030 and almost entirely by 2050. We defeat the fossil fuel industry in the next 9 years. That's a huge job, but it is well underway and entirely possible because, thanks to the climate organizing already done, they are weak, unstable, and increasingly regarded as criminal. We must leave most of that carbon in the ground. Stability is not an option anymore. We either descend into chaos or rise to a new vision of who we are and how everything is connected to everything else, a vision of interconnectedness and collaboration and care. And there are goals worth aspiring to. When the IPCC report came out last month, a lot of people's response was terror and dismay, although the bad news was really not new, but the good news was really interesting. And I ran across a British climate physicist named Piers Forster, who tweeted about it and wrote to him, and he wrote me back, "There is much more certainty that if we get to net zero CO2, its contributions to further warming is also likely to stop." Did you hear that? Is also likely to stop. We can not only limit this process, we can stop it. Many extremes are related to temperature. So if we halt warming, most extremes will stop getting worse. He asserts we have a good chance, if we go all out, at stopping temperature rise at 1.5 centigrade. That was one of the remarkable things, actually. I was at the Paris Climate Conference. My friend, Red Constantino, who's part of the Philippines climate team, brought me to the meeting of the most vulnerable nations. And the rest of the world was going to say 2 degrees was going to be our goal. And they had the chant 1.5 to stay alive. And they shifted these mostly poor nations, the goal of the world, to 1.5, which is such a huge victory. It's so important to the knowing what we're here to do. Piers Forster continues, at net zero, the temperature change should even start to slowly go into reverse. I'm going to read that again because it's so fucking awesome. The temperature change should even start to slowly go into reverse. That is, we can, with massive effort over decades, halt the devastation and even reverse some of it. We are looking at a project unprecedented in scale, including time scale, because it's really from this moment to 2050, but it is not impossible unless we believe it is. There is a factual reality about climate change, but there's also an emotional reality. And for a lot of us this summer, the catastrophes from the heat dome in the Northwest to the 5th season of California wildfires to Hurricane Ida's trail of devastation from New Orleans to New York, the emotional has gotten a lot more intense, more terrifying, more overwhelming. For me too. I would never advocate for ignoring these emotions, but I will advocate for what to do with them. I'm here to talk about climate change and hope, or maybe cheerfulness, which somehow ended up in this talk's title. And I proposed 3 titles, and the organizers from Cooper Union really like the one with cheerful in. And but the way I'd like to think of what I'm trying to do tonight is I'm here to give you tools that might be useful for facing the catastrophe we're immersed in, and maybe for doing something about it. They are emotional and intellectual tools I've found useful both for the external job of trying to take care of the world and the internal job of taking care of myself through my worldview and my commitments. They are yours to do what you like with, including absolutely nothing. Offering advice is always immodest, and if you completely hate these tools, may they prompt you to craft your own good climate work your way. So there's 10 tools I'm going to hand you. You can do anything you like with them. And the first tool is feelings are not facts, but they are responses to facts. So beware of having feelings that aren't based in facts, which could be the description of what's been happening in our country over the past 5 years, whether it's about climate, reproductive rights, trans rights, climate, the environment, history, the fucking Confederacy, racism, or anything else, but I digress. That we have messed up the climate and it has changed and continues to change is a fact, and a terrible one. It fills me with sadness and anxiety and worry, and generally weighs on me a lot. I'm never here to say don't have your feelings, unless they're not grounded in the facts and possibilities. I run across a lot of people who have feelings related to inaccurate analysis of the situation, or no analysis at all, just a sort of vague apprehension that shit is fucked up, and they feel a lot of dread. One of the most curious things about the climate crisis, it's very different than a lot of other crises, is that the ignorant are very often more grim and fatalistic than the experts including the scientists, the organizers, and the policymakers, deep in the data and politics and possibilities. For some damn reason, the ignorant like to spread their doom and despair. In this case, the 2 things I constantly hear people say is it's too late and there's nothing we can do, when these are first of all excuses for doing nothing or a sabotage of the people doing something. That's not what the experts in the field say, the leading scientists and policy wonks and organizers. There is so much we can do, and because there is, we must do it. It is what we owe to the future, to other species, to the earth that sustains us, to the vulnerable now, to the preservation of the past, because we're seeing historical and ancient things being destroyed by fires in the West. The archive of the great nature writer Barry Lopez burned down last fall. The Sequoia National Forest, our national park, is in flames now, threatening trees that are thousands of years old. So, and it's also what we owe, we who are no longer young, to those who still are, as well as to those yet to come. I'm trying to do this, I'm very revved up for this, and I'm trying to read the text I've been working on for a week. And of course I improvise a little and then I try and get back to it. And I'm sorry if it gets a little jumbly. And I'm also sorry that there seems to be a helicopter out the window. So back to the text. We are in a decisive decade. We still have time to choose the best and not the worst scenarios. We know what to do, and that knowledge is getting more refined, more precise, more creative all the time. We have the solutions. In the Great Climate March 7 years ago, in the run-up to the Paris Climate Conference, that was the banner I fell in love with the most. We have the solutions. It was true in 2014. It's even truer now. And by the solutions, I think they meant, and I mean, the renewable energy technologies that mean we can do this remarkable thing. We can actually leave the age of fossil fuels behind, an energy revolution bigger than the Industrial Revolution, in which we will no longer get energy from fire for almost the first time, leaving out hydropower and a few things we've had. Which goes back, and windmills and water mills going way back, but still, we can leave fire, the burning of fossil fuels behind. Elegant new solutions keep emerging for other climate problems and aspects of problems, from cement production to transportation to agriculture. The only obstacles are political and imaginative. Political for the vested interests, politicians as well as fossil profiteers, imaginative for those who cannot see the way forward, sometimes because they didn't look. Do not feed your feelings on fictions. That is the first tool. The second tool is maybe the other end of the first tool. It's to be used against anyone saying the other thing I hear the inactivists and doomsayers saying all the time that makes me just crazy. They say nobody is doing anything about this, which means not that nobody's doing anything, but they're not looking at what we're doing. So much is happening at so many scales. It is not yet enough, but it is far, far more than was being done 5 years ago, let alone 10, never mind 20. And this growth means that enough is conceivable. We can keep scaling up, and it's not arithmetical, it's leaps and bounds and multiplication. And, the climate movement has grown in power, sophistication, and inclusiveness and won many battles. But it's not just climate activists. It's not just us here advocating people do things. A lot of politicians, including the Democratic Party in Congress and the White House, and Democratic governors and mayors, are on board with climate as a pressing matter of supreme urgency in a way very few of them were even 5 years ago during the Obama era. I kind of wanted to write a digression about how wimpy the climate movement of 15 years ago was, with its homilies about how global warming would probably get really bad in the time of their grandchildren. So let's buy compact fluorescent light bulbs and Priuses. But one sentence is plenty for that, because the movement is not wimpy now. And it's not just the movement, which is really thousands of movements with thousands of campaigns in hundreds of countries around the world, looking at all the different parts of the problem and all the different solutions. The movement has gotten the message to the public and to elected officials, or at least some of them, and to young people who can't even vote, but are doing so much of the heavy lifting and who have so much of my love and admiration now. And Galicia Stack, if you're watching, Lozano Stack, I should say, that includes you. I wouldn't say we're winning. That would be too easy, but I would say the wind is at our backs and we have some signal victories behind us. A lot is happening at the local, state, and federal levels, and the Glasgow COP26 climate summit, the UN climate summit, is coming up in about 8 weeks in November, when the nations of the world need to negotiate a real commitment to acting further on the Paris Treaty of 6 years ago, and to decarbonizing the global economy, and putting together a plan to change the world and manage it wisely. Unfortunately, our species has become so powerful, we either manage the planetary systems we depend upon, and all life on Earth does, or we chaotically allow some of us to destroy it for us. But a lot is also happening in cities and states setting their own climate goals and clean energy plans, building codes, transportation systems, and more that matters. And often the little things scale up to become big. For example, this is one of my favorite examples. A city councilwoman in Berkeley named Kate Harrison decided to lead the way a few years ago on that one smallish city banning gas hookups in new construction and saying that from now on, all new buildings would be all electric. That, you could say, oh, one small city, except it set a template for more than 50 California municipalities to follow suit. And this really good idea is now out there in the world, that in a post-fossil fuel world, we're going to have all electric buildings. And the time to start is right now with building codes and design considerations. This has also allowed us to acknowledge something that we completely normalize, which is burning methane gas indoors, where it has serious health impacts for consumers as well as producers, as well as the upper atmosphere. I actually think in the future, we're going to look at how toxic and filthy the fossil fuel was, not just the air in places like New Delhi and Shanghai, we now talk a lot about. The Los Angeles of my youth was like that. But the emissions around the refineries in places like what gets called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, in Richmond in the San Francisco Bay Area that create elevated levels of childhood asthma and other respiratory diseases. At the recent study that said more than 8 million people a year die from fossil fuel caused air pollution, meaning that fossil fuel is actually killing a lot more than COVID, and we should be responding to it with the urgency with which we respond to COVID. But so some ideas to go back to, banning gas hookups are catalysts. They scale or spread the way that Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future spread across the world. I know building codes are not what get most people really excited, but there are always pipeline blockades, sit-ins in recalcitrant senators' offices, mural painting in front of BlackRock headquarters until they divest the huge amount of fossil fuel investments they still are connected to. And then some people actually love city council meetings and want to work on the scale of building codes. Maybe they're architects or urban planners, and they matter too. So there's so many different pieces. I know as nobody's doing anything, so many people are doing so many things. Part of why it sometimes looks like there is no climate movement is that there is a global climate movement so big and diverse and engaged with so many pieces of this huge, many-faceted problem that it doesn't look like any one thing. And it's not going to be people in the streets. It's not going to be young people. It's not going to be Indigenous people in every case. It's not going to be, it's going to look different in Africa. It's going to look different in South Asia. It's going to look different as legislation than it does as protest. It has a million faces. So, and our third tool, this one is kind of a compass or maybe a big neon sign saying, do not fall into the trap of personal virtue. When I ask people what they're doing about climate, they often cite virtuous lifestyle choices like being vegan or not flying. Those are really good things to do. They're also relatively insignificant on an individual scale. The world must change. It will not change because one person does or does not consume something. And I prefer we not imagine ourselves primarily as consumers. And there are ways in which we model for each other what's normal. It's a lot more normal to be vegan than it was 20 years ago. It's normal to think about flying in a way that it didn't used to be. It's normal to think about, and we model different ways of doing things. So, but also sometimes virtue isn't individual. I ride a bicycle in San Francisco because the Bike Coalition created bike lanes that make it much safer. I have 100% clean electricity at home because somebody organized to make that an option, even though our energy company is monstrous. And, it wasn't just individual virtue, it was somebody else. So, it's really the ways we're connected to each other and do things collectively that matter most. The world must change. It will not change because one person does or does not consume something. And I prefer we not imagine ourselves primarily as consumers. I would like us to think ourselves as citizens of the earth, not just of the human world, but of the whole living system, the biosphere and the land and atmospheric and oceanic systems to which we owe understanding, recognition, responsibility, and care. As citizens, we have a responsibility to participate in public life. As citizens massed together, we have the power to participate and affect change. And it's there that change on an adequate scale to this crisis can and does and will happen. Individual choices can slowly scale up, but there are times when focusing on personal virtue seems to me like being at a crime scene and saying, I personally am not murdering this person I'm watching being stabbed to death. That is not what we want integrity and commitment to look like. We want it to be, I am personally intervening to prevent this murder to the best of my ability with whatever resources I have. If you have the capacity, you have the responsibility. The fourth tool is exactly one sentence that you want to keep in your toolbox at all times. It says in letters 1,000 feet high, the future is not yet written. I stole that line from the movie Terminator 2 many years ago. Do not let anyone tell you what is or is not going to happen, which usually bolsters your sense of self and usually sabotages your sense of possibility. Unlikely things happen, and they happen despite people insisting they will never happen. When I was young, a little over 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell, and through nonviolent civil direct action, the whole communist bloc of Eastern Europe liberated itself, and Nelson Mandela, who was supposed to do life in prison, became president of a post-apartheid South Africa. None of these things turned out perfectly, and that's another story about neoliberalism and capitalism and vision and what was and other factors. But these remarkable things happened. And just before they happened, almost no one, including the participants, expected them to happen. And the powerful people assumed they wouldn't happen and made no plans for them to happen. And then suddenly it was like this ripple of change, like watching a crack spread and a wall collapse. There was, according to conventional wisdom of the recent past, never going to be marriage equality or an Indigenous head of the US Department of Interior, or an end to Britain running on coal power, or Texas getting more energy from wind than coal at this very moment, or Iowa getting 37% of its electricity from wind. If you listen to the people who say it will never happen, they will tell you, they will speak as though the future is written, has already been written, and they've read it. They haven't. Don't listen. The historical record tells us that the unexpected happens regularly. And by unexpected, I mean people who thought they knew what was going to happen got surprised. Christiana Figueres, whose book is right here, and it's quite wonderful and cheering, by the way. Is everything backwards for you as it is for me on the screen? It's The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. So anyway, the Costa Rican climate leader, Christiana Figueres, led 192 nations to a successful global climate treaty in 2015, blurted when she was first asked to take on the job after the failed climate convention in Denmark, that the job was impossible. But she took it anyway, which I think was such a remarkable thing to do. And you see with most of the great leaders, the Martin Luther Kings, the Quaker men who in the 18th century decided to end slavery in the British Empire, the coalition of Immokalee workers, people who decided to do things that everyone said was impossible. She was told, everyone agreed it was basically impossible. I was there in Paris the night before the Paris Climate Treaty was announced, and the sophisticated people around me were still saying it was impossible, still preparing for failure. Then it succeeded. One of the great days of my lifetime. Those people who set out to change the world often aim at what everyone around them tells them is impossible, and it often is at the outset. The future is not yet written. We are writing it now, and that means changing what is possible. As I sometimes say at Climate Actions, don't ask what will happen, be what happens. Make it possible. Which brings us to the fifth tool, know how change works. Two things happened almost simultaneously last week. There was an announcement for a reality TV show that would pit activists against each other with celebrity judges who seemed supremely unqualified for the job. The winner was apparently going to be allowed the opportunity to grovel before the G20 for more funding, which is not what a lot of organizers and activists want to do in the first place. But what was striking to me is that everything about the concept ignored how organizing works and how change works. A lot of good activism is collaborative or cooperative. Greenpeace is not at war with the Sierra Club. A great activist may look like she's doing very little or go entirely unseen. And I actually heard an activist say, we're not supposed to be upfront. We're not supposed to be visible and audible. We're supposed to be low key. And of course, getting attention on reality TV usually means being a total showboat. So the great activist may look like she's doing nothing much, may seem like a very uncharismatic person, but somehow stuff is happening. People are motivated. On the other hand, people who make themselves a center of attention can often be terrible organizers, talking over others, not listening, sucking up the air in the room, but they might look good to reality TV judges because they're performing. But the main premise misunderstands also how change works, as well as how the people who do it do it. And change does not work on the timeline of reality TV. The other amazing thing that happened last week is that Harvard University finally announced they would divest from fossil fuel. It took organizers 10 years to make that happen. For more than 9 years, you could have looked at the Harvard divestment movement and say, hey, they're not successful. Although they were part of a global divestment movement that got trillions of dollars out of fossil fuel investments, and more than that, raised the question and moved the concept that holding stock in fossil fuels is amoral, causing universities, pension funds, religious groups, individuals, and tons of other entities to withdraw these trillions of dollars. And they really portrayed, in a very powerful way, the fossil fuel industry as criminal, unethical, something you shouldn't associate with. So, and these indirect things I think are so significant. I'm going to talk about them more. And the same way, the Keystone XL Pipeline campaign was for so many years full of wins and losses and stalls and setbacks, as well as the naysayers saying, oh, you've already lost. Why are you bothering? You're never going to win. So, and then the pipeline that was supposed to ship from the Alberta Tar Sands was finally completely, totally finished off this year when Biden came into office. I don't want to portray that as a gift from Joe Biden. I was a debt being paid to the climate activists who made it an important goal and who stuck with it for more than 10 years. So, but my point is, this is not the timeline of reality TV shows. Patience counts. Know how change works. It doesn't always work on your favorite schedule. It doesn't always work directly either, which brings us to the sixth tool, which is possibly an extra drill bit for the previous tool. Know that change is not linear. It radiates outward like ripples from a stone thrown in a pond. It's like an earthquake shaking everything after centuries of tension builds up, a volcano erupting on its own unpredictable schedule, water wearing away stone, the wolves introduced back into the Yellowstone ecology, causing forests and meadows to renew themselves. Indirect consequences can be some of the most important ones. So do not measure actions by whether they have immediate results or whether they have direct ones. And my God, I love indirect consequences more than almost anything. It's been so much part of my hope work, so exciting and exhilarating to track, and really kind of beautiful. I'm going to talk about beauty as a last tool. And I think there's a kind of beauty in these victories, in the dedication that brings them about, and the people who persisted when it didn't seem very likely, in these elegant patterns of indirect consequence. So the Keystone XL campaign was long and hard, and the heroes who fought it did a lot of other things besides stop part of one pipeline. They gave us all, including me, an education in the Alberta Tar Sands, which nobody had really heard a lot about beforehand. We didn't know it was some of the filthiest fossil fuel on Earth, a ticking time bomb that must not be allowed to go off by extracting and burning this exceptionally filthy, low-grade crude in a province in Canada that didn't even have a big fossil fuel industry, and a rich country that doesn't need the money. You can argue with Venezuela or Ecuador that it's pretty tough unless we support them in a lot of ways to ask them to get off fossil fuels. But Canada could do it and should do it and must do it. So, but the Keystone XL campaign built beautiful coalitions between farmers, Native stakeholders, local communities, and an international transborder movement. They taught us why pipelines are a problem and a vulnerable spot, and inspired people to fight and win a lot of other pipeline battles. Each of these climate struggles is an education, and I've learned so much from them. The Keystone XL campaign may have helped inspire the Lakota leaders at Standing Rock, who stood up against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. And I know some of you listening are really young, but probably a lot of you remember what a catalytic, miraculous, beautiful, powerful sort of, gathering of people came, and how much it became part of a public conversation about Indigenous rights, Indigenous culture, Indigenous history, as well as about water protection and pipelines and fossil fuel and climate. A friend from Standing Rock told me it gave the Native youth there and beyond a kind of hope and sense of their own agency and value that matters a lot. That's an immeasurably valuable indirect consequence. It led to so many remarkable things, including what I believe was maybe the hugest intertribal gathering ever, peace made between tribes that had been in conflict since the 19th century in some ways, a gathering of all 7 Lakota Dakota groups, and the healing of some old wounds, notably when hundreds of former soldiers come to support the Standing Rock water protectors, got down on their knees to apologize for what the US Army has been doing to Native Americans since the beginning. A beautiful piece of apology, of healing, of changing a history that remains unfinished. And the other thing that I just love to pieces and kind of like almost tear up at because it's so fucking beautiful. Standing Rock inspired a young woman who'd driven out from New York with her friends to decide to run for office. You wouldn't have heard from her then, but you have now. Her name was Alexandra OcasioCortez. It's exciting to think I'm talking to some of her constituents. Hello, Queens, where my mom was raised. Hello, Bronx. Ocasio-Cortez, as a congresswoman, did so much to amplify the need for and possibility of a Green New Deal. You can say the Green New Deal hasn't passed Congress, and you'd be right. But it too has had incredible indirect consequences. It too changed the game. All my life, people had spoken as though jobs and the environment were posed as an excuse to neglect the environment in the name of jobs, whether it's chopping down forests, polluting rivers, pumping out fossil fuel. But the Green New Deal made it clear that this time protecting the climate creates great jobs, far more than the fossil fuel industry does. It aimed high and encouraged the Biden administration and the Biden campaign to set a strong climate platform, stronger than we'd ever seen in a presidential campaign before. I'm not talking about the primaries where we had some great platforms the last couple of times. I'm talking about the main one. It influenced the contents of the Build Back Better budget reconciliation process, now working its way through Congress. And I want to say to everyone out there, 2 huge things for the fate of the world are happening right now. One is the budget reconciliation, which isn't nearly getting the attention it needs. If we get what's in it, it's the biggest piece of climate legislation yet to appear in this country. And it gets us so much further to our goals, so much closer to where we need to be. The other thing is the climate conference in Glasgow in November. Anybody who wants to work to try and influence the outcome of those, this is the time. But back to the Green New Deal and indirect consequences. Another thing, so the Green New Deal obviously hasn't passed Congress, but it inspired the city of Ithaca to adopt a citywide Green New Deal that aims to make the city carbon neutral by 2030 with 100% renewable electricity by 2025. Green jobs have become a big part of the conversation. Thank you, Green New Deal. If you trace the ripples outward from Standing Rock's water protectors, opposition to a pipeline, to a young woman's decision to run for Congress, and the Sunrise Movement's espousal of a new framework on climate action, to a city's profound rethinking of its energy infrastructure and future, you will begin to see indirect change, which gives me, and I hope gives you, so much hope that our actions matter. How our actions matter, we may not know until afterward. This can help you avoid disappointment. This can help you avoid disappointment when there are no immediate or direct results that you can see. One footnote, too good to leave out. Friday was the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, which, like the Green New Deal, like Standing Rock, is one of those things whose indirect consequences are so significant, changing the national conversation around economic justice, exposing the brutality of medical, housing, and student debt, leading to incredible legislation on student, an action on student debt. Really shifting the conversation about capitalism itself. So 10th anniversary was Friday, and two people who were there, Jonathan Smucker and my dear friend Astra Taylor, who's part of the Incredible Strike Debt Coalition, wrote about a piece of it that's another great indirect consequence piece of the puzzle. They write, Guido Girgenti was 19 years old and a sophomore at Occidental College when he joined Occupy Los Angeles and helped organize the Occupy Colleges network. In the decades since, Girgenti helped co-found the Sunrise Movement, which of course did so much to push the Green New Deal, and is now the media director for Justice Democrats, an organization that recruits and supports progressive insurgents running for Congress, including Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, and Jamal Bowman, end quote. And beginning of a sip of water, brought my special mug, which you're probably also seeing backwards, a gift from a friend. It says Antifa, because I'm very into anthood, very not into fascism. So the seventh tool is really important. It's your imagination. There's so many kinds of failure of imagination at the root of this crisis, an inability to perceive both the terrible and the wonderful, an inability among some to imagine how all these things are connected, how what we burn in our power plants and car engines pumps out carbon dioxide that goes up into the sky, that increases the greenhouse insulation, that raises the temperature, that destabilizes the climate. To imagine that the world has been so stable and reassuring a place to inhabit over these 10,000 years is now destabilized and full of new perils and feedback loops is a leap too many people haven't made. There's also an inability to imagine that we can actually do what is necessary, and what is necessary is nothing other than building a new world, and of necessity, a better world. If we succeed, those who come after will look back on the age of fossil fuel, on our own time, on the time in which I've spent so many decades now, as an age of corruption and poison. We often talk about climate in terms of like, oh, we're living in this great time now, but things are going to get worse. But they can get better, because fossil fuel is this filthy poison that's killing, almost 9 million people a year, according to those calculations, that's corrupting our national and and global politics. It's the basis for so many wars. And it's at the root of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It's such a corrosive force in so many ways. If we succeed, those who come after will look back on the age of fossil fuel as an age of corruption and poison. We will have decentered energy production and the power that dismantled the power that goes with it. Your grandchildren will want to hear horror stories about how people burn great mountains and oceans of poisonous stuff dug up from deep underground. Burn this stuff that made children sick and birds die, and the air get filthy and hard to breathe, and the planet heat up and get chaotic. We must remake the world, and we can remake it better. And the COVID-19 pandemic is proof that if we take a crisis seriously, we can change everything almost overnight, dramatically, globally, and nationally. I remember when the pandemic hit, we suddenly stopped flying, we stopped circulating the way we did. We changed how everything worked, how education worked. And the US government pulled $3 trillion out of its hat. They keep saying they can't afford to do, what we need to do. The budget reconciliation bill is $3.5 trillion over 10 years, which makes it so much cheaper than what we did in 1 year for COVID. And of course, so much cheaper than the US military. Another failure of the imagination. We have everything we need. We have the resources. We just need the sense of urgency. We just need to overcome the political obstacles. We just need to be more powerful than the fossil fuel industry. So fact-checking and knowing who to listen to constitute the eighth tool. Imagination and accuracy have to counterbalance each other. There are those too stuck in the present to be able to imagine the world could be otherwise. There are those who are gullible, deluded, easily misled, undermined by magical thinking and unrealistic scenarios. Thinking seriously about the future requires what we could call pragmatic imagination. Factual accuracy and precision are important, and waves of climate lies have washed over the public for decades, mostly sponsored by the climate industry and their allies. The age of climate denial as such, which they pushed for the last few decades, is largely over. The fossil fuel corporations have new tactics now, and they're pushing a new round of lies. It's very important to understand clearly the nature of the problem and the solutions, and to not buy into their false complacency and their false solutions. They're spending a lot right now on advertising that suggests, first of all, that they're on board with addressing the climate catastrophe and that they themselves should be trusted to create solutions. Some of this is outright lies. Sometimes they're taking some tiny little podunk project they're doing that doesn't offset even 1,000th of the carbon dioxide they're pumping into the atmosphere and making it sound like a really big deal. Sometimes they're pushing carbon capture, which is not a meaningful technology and probably never will be on the scale it would need to be if we're going to keep burning fossil carbon like this. So it's really important to fact check and know what solutions are real and what are bogus, see who's spreading them, and stick with the real solutions. Carbon capture is really about the fact that there's also a bunch of people who like big tech solutions, and there's a very nice old joke that keeps going around and can go around forever as far as I'm concerned. An old joke that says the best carbon capture technology possible is called a tree. Technological carbon capture does not exist in any meaningful way. It does not seem as if it can scale up to address the problem of fossil fuel emissions, unlike trees which scale up into those things we call forests. Protecting forests is actually one of the most beautiful parts of what we need to do, protecting the existing ones, planting new ones, spreading trees, looking also at grasslands as carbon sinks, at how agriculture can also be a carbon sequestering technology, not like these big machines they want, but doing what the plant world has always done for us, and the plants that made the world we live in, that sequestered and buried all the carbon we're now excavating and burning. So, and I could go on, and climate scientist Michael Mann writes, in his own recent book, Bill Gates insists that renewable energy is inadequate to decarbonize our economy at present. Peer-reviewed research suggests he's wrong about that. Mark Jacobson of Stanford University's Solutions Project concluded 4 years ago that almost every nation on Earth already has the natural resources, sun and wind and maybe hydro, to make a full transition to 100% renewable energy, which means we don't need this carbon capture stuff as an excuse for keep letting the fossil fuels keep burning. It means so many good things. It means that the future we need is truly possible. We have the solutions. So there's imagining the future. There's a kind of remembering the past that I think is a great counterweight to it. And you could call memory or historical imagination. The American left, someone once told a friend of mine at a workshop, probably 30 years ago, for left-wing activist burnout. The American left, they told her, is bad at celebrating its victories. We have victories. Some of them are very large, and why your life is the shape it is, particularly if you're not straight or white or male. And there are defeats that matter as well, and there's so much unfinished business. But in my lifetime, the world has changed so profoundly in so many ways for the better. And these victories are reminders that we are not powerless. Our work is not futile. We are not without ancestors in this work, and its traces are all around us. And we in turn need to be good ancestors to what is to come, to be people who will be remembered with gratitude for what we did in this present to make a future that was livable. The future is not yet written, but by reading the past, we see patterns that help us shape that future skillfully. This is what I was talking about at the beginning. The slow cumulative shifts that I believe are in the end, dismantling an old civilization and building a new one. The indigenous acknowledgements are a tiny part of it, but there's so many pieces. And I'm going to skip because time is running low. My assertion, essay yet to be written, that essentially what's going on with Black Lives Matter, this indigenous resurgence, this taking down of statues, changing of place names, rethinking of gender and sexuality, of our relationship to the non-human and natural world, and so much else, is we're essentially dismantling an old and powerful culture and building a new and better and more inclusive and kinder and less destructive one. It's a huge project that terrifies the right. And all that fussing about critical race theory and the rest is their backlash because, and their defensive Confederate statues. They know that history is incredibly powerful and it's very important to decide how it will be told, which is why it's important for us to remember that too, which we don't always. But I do want to read this incredibly beautiful example of knowing recent history as well as long-term history from my wonderful friend, the climate journalist, oil policy wonk, and climate organizer, Antonia Juhas. She wrote a year ago in Sierra Magazine, "Today, the global oil industry is in a tailspin. Demand has cratered, prices have collapsed, and profits are shrinking. The oil majors, giant global corporations, including BP, Chevron, and Shell, are taking billions of dollars in losses while cutting tens of thousands of jobs. Smaller companies are declaring bankruptcy, and investors are looking elsewhere for returns." Digression from me, and then I'll get back to Antonia. The fun thing with the divestment movement is the first few years were like, you should divest because it's the virtuous thing to do. And all these institutions dragged their feet, including Harvard. And then we got to say, if you had divested, you wouldn't be losing your shirt now with all these stocks that are tanking. Back to Antonia. The oil industry is in such dire straits today because of the multiple crises it has faced since well before the pandemic. These upheavals are largely the result of the decades of organizing that have cast a dark shadow over the industry and exposed the harms associated with oil. That's a victory worth counting. She continues, this advocacy has helped to shut down and delay fossil fuel projects through direct action protest, bring about current and expected policies to cut demand and production, make sustainable transportation and renewable energy more accessible and affordable, and reduce the political and economic benefits of supporting the oil industry. The result of the organizing and advocacy is death by 1,000 cuts, leaving behind an industry producing too much of a commodity that is of shrinking value. Isn't that extraordinary? And they are these gigantic forces that have loomed over us for, in some cases, a century, but they're brittle, tottering. We can destroy them. We brought them to this condition of fragility. We are powerful and we could achieve the decisive victories against them we need in this decade. To remember that things were different and to remember that they've changed and how they change is to be equipped to make change and to recognize it in the process, and often to be hopeful, because hope lies in the possibility of things being different and our power to participate in determining that difference. Despair and depression often come from the sense that nothing will change or we have no capacity to impact that change. Sometimes it's to know that this very moment is a total miracle. Early in this century, we had no real adequate alternative to fossil fuel. Wind and solar were primitive and expensive. And one of the great miracles of our time has been a slow, wonky engineering and production miracle, which is that the price of renewables, just like the graphs look like this, they've just crashed. Solar and wind are just intensely cheaper, making now cheaper in almost every part of the world than fossil fuel, therefore successfully competitive. And that's partly because of economies of scale. That's also because They are so much more effective. The turbines are so much better. The solar panels are so much better. It is the great unnoticed revolution of our era. And it is just astounding. And often I see figures that are like, oh, they're this much cheaper since 2019 or even 2010. For example, since 2010, the cost of solar has dropped by 82%. But if you go back to 2000, if you look over the last 21 years, it's not just 82%, which should be plenty. It's more than twice that, maybe 3 times that. It is astounding, and I hope you find it as exciting and encouraging as I do. And it's kind of beautiful, this quiet, incremental transformation that made a completely different future, a future in which the things we love survive possible. And that brings me to our last tool, and not the least important by a long shot, beauty. Beauty takes a lot of forms, and it reminds us that life is worth living. Beauty is what we take pleasure in, and it's not just prettiness, not just eye candy. Climate chaos makes us fear that we will lose what is beautiful in this world. I want to say that in 50 and 100 years, the moon will rise and it will be beautiful. It will shine its silvery light across the sea, even if the coastline isn't where it used to be. In 50 years, the light on the mountains, or the way each raindrop clings to blades of grass and refracts light, will still be beautiful. Flowers will bloom and they will be beautiful. Some places, if we do what we should, may be far more beautiful. One of the extraordinary things in my lifetime is that we stopped doing some terrible things. We stopped some of the air and water pollution. We protected some species. We stopped using DDT in this country. I'm just to the north of me is Marin County, where there's actually a lot more wildlife. When I grew up at the north end of the county, no mountain lions, no elephant seals, no coyotes, and brown pelicans were almost extinct, and foxes I never saw during a childhood of running around on the hills and stuff. All those species are there now. White-tailed kites have recovered, and and other things, of course, have gotten worse. But if we do what we should, species recover. Some parts of the world could be far more beautiful if we stop doing some of the damage we do. If we go all the way, a lot of it could be more beautiful. And we'll see the ugliness of this era of fossil fuels, rampant economic equality. Part of what we're fighting for is beautiful. Part of what we are fighting for, I'm sorry I'm having such a hard time reading my own words tonight. Part of what we are fighting for is beauty, and it's essential to keep sight of this. And that means leaving room for beauty and giving your attention to beauty in the present. If you forget what you're fighting for, you can become miserable, bitter, and lost, and ultimately not so useful to your cause. In that light, we could say that joy and beauty are among your duties. For a long time, we've told horror stories about ice and coral reefs and violent weather events to try to wake people up to the fact that the climate is changing. I have a different fear now. We feared then that people wouldn't see that it's changing. I fear now that this chaos will come to seem inevitable and even normal, like someone whose whole life has been lived during wartime, as so many young Afghanis have. Americans under 50 sometimes think homelessness is inevitable and permanent and how it always was. But I'm older than the problem. I remember before it was a mass reality, and I remember how it was created, which means that we could uncreate it. I remember before student debt was a crushing force, which means that we could uncreate student debt as this monstrosity limiting the freedom of all of you to do the things, follow your dreams, whether it's to be an activist, to pursue an education, to buy a house, to have a kid, to do something more meaningful and less lucrative than the jobs you get shunted into with that fucking debt. And so memory, and beauty. I believe we now need to tell stories about how beautiful, how rich, how harmonious the earth we inherited was, and sometimes is, how beautiful the orderly patterns were, and in some places and times still are, and how much we can do to restore some of this, to protect what survives, to take that beauty as a sacred trust, to hold the memory of it, to seek to bring it back, to seek it in daily life where it's still present. And beauty in your everyday life can take so many forms. It can mean noticing the birds on the walk to the train every morning, or exulting in the very quality of water when you swim laps at the local pool, or a pond or lake or river or the sea, or making a birthday cake from scratch for your best friend, or watering your garden, or dancing under the moon, or dandling a baby. We're doing all this climate work so that in 100 years, someone, many someones, millions, billions of someones can do these things, so that birds can build nests and lay eggs, deciduous trees can bud out in spring, salmon can swim up rivers. We should enjoy what we're fighting for. Otherwise, we might forget why we're fighting. One of the reasons I've been an activist of sorts most of my adult life, other than the fact that my amazing brother David kind of made me do it, is to be with the most idealistic, most generous, most passionate people. Being with them has been the reward for activism. People often think activism is eating your broccoli, but I want to tell you, activism can be your cream puff and your champagne. It can bring you in touch with these amazing people. It can put you right where things are happening. It can give you back your sense of power and purpose and meaning. Emotions and values are contagious, and this is a way to be around the best of them. And of course, there are trolls and infighting and miseries in organizing, and a lot of budgets and bureaucracies involved in changing the world. But there's still, no matter what, moral beauty and empathic imagination, the commitment to others, the vision of a better world, the largeness of the dreams and hopes and commitments of organizers, activists that engaged and committed. So if you're not already in that world, I invite you to it, not just as your duty, but as a joy, a pleasure, a beauty. The Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I often worry that the pursuit of happiness seems to produce a lot of unhappiness. That is, if we expect happiness as our birthright, we can easily turn that into expectation that we should not encounter fear, difficulty, sadness, melancholy, should not have to face the suffering of others, of ourselves, or the uncertainties of the future. As an alternative to happiness, may I offer joy, which coexists with sorrow and helps us understand why sadness, the blues, sorrow in songs, in visions in real life can often contain such beauty. We expect happiness to be lasting, a sort of wall-to-wall carpet of the psyche, which is a destructive expectation, but we know joy springs up unexpectedly and subsides. It can spring up almost anywhere. For me, a lot of joy comes from meaning, from meaningfulness, and depression comes from meaninglessness, a sense of meaninglessness. I find meaning in maintaining my own routines and trying to do good work and good companionship and feeling connected to larger patterns and causes. Of course, climate is breaking patterns, and part of what we're doing is defending those patterns in the natural world. I think in this regard of the Auschwitz survivor, Viktor Frankl, and here I want to say that Frankl, like so many Holocaust survivors, is also somebody who survived the end of the world as Native people did in a very different way. And so in a way, we have as examples before us people whose world ended, but whose lives didn't end, and who went on and did the best they could. But in our case, I think the end of the world doesn't have to mean the end of the best things. It could mean the end of the worst things. It's a choice we're making in this decade. But back to Viktor Frankl, he believed that survival in that death camp of Auschwitz depended in part on having a sense of purpose. That was the difference between who survived and who didn't. And he concluded that we don't need an easy life without stress, which is often what happiness suggests, at least as we talk about it in this country. Instead, we need a meaningful goal, work towards a purpose. So yeah, cheerfulness, as in the title of this talk, but not necessarily happiness. Instead, I want to ask that we look at beauty and joy instead, which I think is where we find that meaning and order and pattern and purpose. I want to end, and I have Adrienne Marie Brown's an advanced copy of her new book, Holding Change, up here. She's been such an exciting inspiration. And part of, I think, a really new way of thinking about activism as joy as a necessary part of activism, activism is joyful or pleasurable. She wrote not long ago, I believe that all organizing is science fiction, that we are shaping the future we long for and have not yet experienced. I believe that we are in an imagination battle. So I'm here to thank and try and encourage those of you who are already in that battle, encourage others of you to join it, to see what can be meaningful, rewarding, joyful, as well as responsible about taking it on. And I want to end, and yes, I am actually going to end. That's something you can also hope for at the end of this paragraph. I want to say we cannot see all the way to the transformed society that we need, but that does not mean it is impossible. We will reach it not by one great leap, but a long journey, step by step. If we see how impossible our current reality might have seemed 20 years ago, that solar would be so cheap, that Scotland would get 97% of its electricity from renewables, that fossil fuel corporations would be in free fall, we can trust that we could be moving towards an even more transformed and transformative future, and that it is not a set destination, but for better or worse, what we're making up as we go. The future is not yet written, we are writing it. Each shift makes more shifts possible, but only if we actively go towards the possibilities rather than passively into the collapse. Let us face our fears and walk through them towards our dreams. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Rebecca for her time and energy that she shared with us tonight. And now I'm going to ask a couple questions from the audience. The first question comes from X Angles. Can you talk more about how culture and art can serve as a foundation of change, including political change?
It always does. I think of culture as like the subsoil and politics as this very superficial thing on top. Politics is how we legislate our values and beliefs, but culture is what creates those values and beliefs. And in this sense, I think of Black Lives Matter, for example, as culture is changing the conversation, of making people aware of police brutality, of inequality, of the possibility of change, of last year actually changing the physical landscape of this country by changing the cultural landscape of statues of Confederates and slaveholders. And I love seeing that everyone immediately made the connection to Christopher Columbus, and that in Europe, they tore down the statues of King Leopold, who carried out a genocide in the Congo of people who were part of the British slave trade, more Columbuses, etc. Ideas, there's a wonderful line by the radical poet Muriel Rukeyser where she said, the world is not made out of atoms, it is made out of stories. We tell stories. The conservative story is that nothing is connected to anything else. Poverty is the result of your own fault, and your own mistakes and flaws. We owe nothing to anybody. The stuff that comes out of my tailpipe has nothing to do with the climate. And ultimately, it becomes a kind of nihilism, and where even facts become something you can have as a sort of free market of ideas and don't have to adhere to a collective body of historical truth. We saw that so much in the last 5 years with the right during and after Trump. And I've seen how ideas change. There was a wonderful moment when Terry Gross, with her inevitable intrusive questions, asked Gloria Steinem, so you didn't get married until you're in your 60s. And Gloria Steinem said, first I had to reinvent the institution of marriage, which was her way of saying that marriage when Steinem, who's now in her 80s, was a young woman. When I was growing up, and my mother's marriage was really kind of a master-servant owner-property relationship in which the husband had an enormous amount of rights and control over the wife, and the wife gave up an enormous amount of rights, including over bodily self-jurisdiction, the right to say no to sex, control of her earnings, her property, her children, gave up her name, sometimes gave up her whole name and became Mrs. John Smith. And, and we changed that. And that was by a bunch of cultural arguments that led to legislation. We outed the impact of domestic violence and finally made the police and legal system treat it as something real and criminal and not just you should cook nicer dinners, etc. You can look at a million things. And I was born into a world in which to be queer was to be considered mentally ill or criminal or both. And it's very simple to say, oh, legislation changed that, but legislation is usually the end result of a lot of cultural change. It's actually a million people who came out of the closet and talked to their friends and coworkers and neighbors and went public and changed, even for us straight people, our sense of our own sexuality, of how open the definition of male and female can be. And everything about being human, beyond biology is culture, and even how we understand and interpret biology, like sex and gender, is cultural and is changing. So, and I feel like that, that was rambling and inadequate, but it's all made out of stories.
Definitely not. Let's go to the next question from Darlene Woolnick. How do we translate the hope that we organizers have to non-organizers and non-activists?
And that's why I was really trying to talk to non-organizers with this talk. And hello, Darlene. And I totally get that this is one of the responsibilities of organizers, is to inspire people. But I also feel like people who are not yet engaged, in a sense, it's like, do we invite you to the picnic, or do you make a picnic yourself or find the picnic you want to participate in? And the picnic might be a trivial thing, but it's, and I understand there are definitely people who are so strapped, single moms and students working students. And I worked throughout my undergrad and graduate career on people in prison, people facing kinds of oppression. But a lot of us do have the capacity to be engaged. And so part of how I do it is by trying to say, this is, as I said at the end of the talk, this is a really good way to live. Was an old wobbly saying, don't mourn, organize. And I think it creates a false binary. I know there's a lot of climate grief and climate fear out there. I do think that you can mourn and organize, and the organizing really helps you with the mourning and maybe turns it into something other than mourning. The mourning is often the sense of losing something, but I do believe, there are parts of climate change that we cannot reverse in the next 30 years, like sea level rise is inevitable, but the temperature itself, what happens to a lot of species, what happens to the most vulnerable human beings and places, the fate of the forests, from the boreal forest to the rainforest. These are decisions that we have a role in. And I think that the mourning is mitigated by the organizing. So mourn and organize is also something I feel, that the two, that the organizing really helps with the mourning and may change it into something else. So, and I think giving people a sense of possibility. And there is a huge part of the left who thinks its job is to tell you everything is worse than, and I understand, like, if you grow up in the mainstream, you often have the sense the mainstream is telling you, father knows best, trust authority, the status quo is just fine the way it is, America is not racist, etc. And there are things like that America always has been racist and that it's systemic and not just individual, that are really true. But and it's important to talk about those things. But I think a lot of the left thinks its job is only to talk about those things. I see my job and everybody's job is also to talk about where we win, how we've won, on the other side of the equation, there are stories are not telling you about how racists, the mainstream isn't telling you about how racist they are, but they're stories they're not telling us about how powerful we are, because the last thing they want us to know is how powerful we are. And I've seen with Occupy Wall Street, it scared the titans of industry around the world. The climate movement has the fossil fuel industry terrified. They know we can defeat them, and we have weakened and criminalized them. So I think it's also, what stories do we tell? Do we tell stories that make people feel powerful, that show them a way forward, that show them that this work is worth doing? Are we cheerful companions to be with? It's another way cheerful may come up. Are you somebody other people want to organize with, or are you, yourself a steaming mound of toxic waste? And, so some of those things, but it's a really good question I need to think about more. One of the joys of being a writer is that you have, a day to a week to a year to 5 years to think over something as you write it. And the fact that it sentenced me to an apparent lifetime of extemporaneous public life is something I'm still coming to terms with, cheerfully.
Thank you. I'm going to combine the next two questions because they're both about visual culture. So I think we can maybe answer them in one swoop. So please talk more about how essential it is for artists and writers to create the imaginaries we need to move forward, and the influence of Afro and Indigenous futurisms. Dystopic visions need antidotes. And that's from Utopias for All. And then we have a question from Simon. I'm just going to put them all in together, but I wonder what your perspective is about climate imagery. There are times I feel that because we're also inundated with images in our modern world, that images might otherwise horrify us lose their power.
To Simon's question, I think that we do get really jaded, and whether it's violence in video games and movies and TV and things like that, war, and real violence in news coverage, etc. To say nothing of pornographic violence against women. But I actually think, and I said towards the end of this talk, for a long time, we thought our job was to convince everybody that climate change is real and terrible and happening. We need to do something about it. And I think just as the fossil fuel interests are done with full-on climate denial, that is over. It's too late to try and convince people that climate change isn't happening. Now they're trying to convince people it's not urgent. We're doing enough. We don't need to do we don't need to make them cease to exist. But I think that actually what we're not doing and what we need to do is say the world right now is incredibly beautiful. And I spent my whole life hearing environmentalists say, like, oh, when billions of bison thundered over the prairies and passenger pigeons blocked out the sky, the world is impoverished compared to what it used to be. And now here we are, I've just turned 60 this summer, and it's like, it is not what it was in 1750, but there's still a lot of incredibly rich and beautiful and wild stuff out there. And so I feel like we also need to tell people that there's something worth loving and protecting, and that we can succeed in protecting some of it to help people. I think we also need to see the earth as a collection of elegantly orchestrated interlocking systems, rather than seeing the isolated objects of alienated capitalism. And so that part of what we need to help people see is connection. And I think to make the world we need to make, we need to understand that connectedness, that what we do has an impact, both for better or worse. And now back, and as for visual culture and artists and what they do, I think, which is the first question, yet you combine the two, and there's two pieces to that. I see people doing very powerful visual imagery, sometimes directly in climate campaigns, sometimes representationally. That could be any number of different things. I have to admit, I'm a Ted Lasso fan, and there was an amazing episode in which Sam recognized that Emirates Oil, the fictional Emirates Oil Company, his father told him was destroying Nigeria, and he blacked it out on his jersey, and then the whole team blacked it out. And so they had a climate strike against an oil company on a TV show that a lot of people enjoy. And like, that's a work of art that was pretty exciting to see. My friend, who was actually friends with Ken Saro-Wiwa, who resisted the real fossil fuel corporations in Nigeria, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was hung by the government in cahoots with the fossil fuel industry, wept when he saw that Ted Lasso thing. But more than that, it probably made, it raised the question in a new arena. But what I do worry about, because I spent a lot of my life in the visual arts, is people making pretty things or elegant things that are relatively arcane and have small audience and saying, I've done my bit. No matter what you are, whether you're a doctor or a scientist or a daycare worker or an artist or a poet, you never stop being a citizen. And I wish we had a better word. I never mean citizen and what your immigration status is. Dreamers to me are citizens if they live here. Immigrant green card holders are citizens, and documented people are citizens in the larger sense. And as citizens, we also need to vote, participate in political processes, have these conversations. And in the 80s and 90s, I saw a lot of artists making relatively arcane things of it, and with the sense that this is all I have to do. And I don't think it is. I think particularly now, with 9 years on our clock of where we need to be by 2030, pretty soon 8 years, we need kind of every shoulder to the wheel. And, so sometimes art really does it. And it also gives people a kind of respite. And my book, Orwell's Roses, or The Galleys, is up there. Orwell was a great lover of gardening and roses and natural beauty and pleasure, and thinking about how one of our great voices against authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, and lies devoted so much of his time to planting and growing things, raises a lot of really interesting questions about pleasure and beauty that matter. And one of the essays I quote in it is by my friend Lawrence Weschler, who wrote about talking to the judge in the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague for the war criminals on trial for what they did in the former Yugoslavia. And he asked the judge how he could stand to listen day after day, year after year, to these horrible things people did to their neighbors, their former friends, their schoolmates, their fellow villagers. And the judge paused for a moment, and then his face brightened. He said, "Oh, after work, I go look at the Vermeers in the museum." And I read that 20 years ago. It stuck with me ever since, because it says somebody who's doing really important work, justice after war crimes, being a judge, listening to atrocity stories, found pleasure in these 300-year-old paintings, which means that we don't always know. We often think that art has to be propaganda and it's about preaching to the unconverted, but the converted don't always need preaching to, or the preaching they need is beauty and encouragement and support. And it was really interesting thinking, not quite knowing what the judge found in it, thinking, Weschler writes about Vermeer painting in a time of war and turbulence, and thinking, well, what do we really need? Orwell needed his gardens, his flowers, his roses, his fruit trees, his time in the natural world. He began writing 1984, the great novel about totalitarianism that gave us so many terms from Big Brother and Memory Hole and etc. He began it by following his long dream of living on an island off the coast of Scotland, and spent that first summer there planting a garden almost on the scale of a farm. Eventually, he had 2 cows, a horse, a pig, a bunch of chickens, geese, was fishing and shooting the occasional rabbit and growing a bunch of stuff they ate, which also got them through post-war rationing in a very hungry Britain. And that's what he needed to do to write 1984, which would do so much work in the world and still does. So I always like to keep in mind that we don't know exactly what people need. There's a wonderful phrase, I go into depth in this book, Bread and Roses. Bread is the physical, practical sustenance that we all need. And of course, it means more than bread, and it's the sort of food, clothing, shelter, medical care. But what are the roses? And this is something Orwell and the suffragist socialists who brought us the phrase bread and roses were devoted to, which is the idea that we need beauty, pleasure, free time, leisure, education, access to art and culture, that we need something that can't be quantified and other people can't decide for us. It might be that you need a garden. It might be that you need to surf. It might be that you need to spend time with small children. It might be that you need to knit, or raise rabbits. We can't decide for other people. And so those are, and again, I feel very rambly, but those are some of the things I've been thinking about, and that Orwell and his roses have helped me think about.
Amazing. This is just a technical question from somebody, and I recognize the book cover, but the name isn't coming up to me, but she says, Anne Duhamel, what a beautiful, inspiring, hopeful talk. I am so grateful for what you have shared. Thank you. What is the colorful book on your shelf next to Orwell's Roses? So the one in between All We Can Save and
It's Ross Gay's catalog of unabashed gratitude. Ross Gay is a very joyous poet. He's Black. He's brilliant. He wrote the most incredible poem about Eric Garner, about after Eric Garner was killed by the police, the things he had planted as a worker for the city's, I forget what you call the planting department, were still blooming. He's an incredible poet. I'm not in my usual home. I'm staying someplace else. I brought a bunch of books with me, and I was like, okay, I'm going to line up a climate shelf. And I cheated and threw Orwell's Roses, which does have climate aplenty in it. And then I was like, we need some pleasure and beauty. There's definitely some in Adrienne Marie Brown. There's some in all these books, quite a lot of it in all these books. A book by my Icelandic friend, Andre Sneyer Magnusson. But I threw Ross Gay in because as an avid gardener, he's attending every day to the plants that sequester carbon and release oxygen and make the atmosphere for us, and the greatest gift animals could possibly receive.
Amazing. The last question that we'll have time for is from Kelly Colwell. I'd love to hear more about how to know/decide when you're doing enough. I often feel guilty for the time spent appreciating and resting when things feel so urgent.
I think that's a personal decision. And I think like a lot of people grew up in the mainstream and took refuge in the left, and all their critique is of the mainstream. I kind of grew up in the left, and therefore I'm very critical of it in some ways. I think there's a sense on the left, by which I mean sort of all the progressive and radical and engaged stuff on our side, and you know what I mean, is that if you're not living a life of austerity and total dedication, and that you're not doing enough, and there's a lot of kind of patrolling other people and telling them when they're, what they should be doing. And like all these fucking armchair critics telling the people who are actually doing the work, whether the great climate journalist David Roberts named them the Doing It Wrong Brigade. And, but I also think, I got attacked by somebody for talking about doing a Black Lives Matter protest last year and also buying a shirt online. And I was like, look, I was at the Rodney King protests in 1991. I'm going to be doing this for my whole life. It will overlap with buying pretty shirts. And this is kind of what I love about Orwell. He was very urgent about fighting totalitarianism and the corruption of the left, as many of its members supported Stalin and Stalinism. And he kept gardening. And I think you have to look at, how do I do this in the long term? And how do I become a person who's not bitter and miserable, because that's contagious? And I think a bit of joy and beauty and pleasure is also contagious. And so you go eat your cupcakes or take your walks or play with your dog. And that's going to help you both bring other people, take care of the other people and bring them into the movement and make it a joyous movement and keep you going for what looks now the next 30 years. We need to be deeply engaged with climate, and then maybe we'll have a world in which we're like, okay, we fixed it and we just have to maintain all these systems and new ways of doing things. But enough is a personal question, and it's also recognizing it's nobody's job to do everything. Particularly if you're a woman, you might have been told it is, and in personal and private as well as public life. But it's everybody's job who, if they're not overburdened already, and I mentioned prisoners and single moms with, without a lot of support and et cetera. But it's everybody's job to do something. And, and so it's partly about looking at, do I feel just like I should be miserable and frenzied, or am I looking at the quality of what I'm doing and the impact of what I'm doing? And you can have something that becomes very catalytic that, can start out very small. And that city councilwoman in Berkeley did something by deciding that convincing the city council to have the unanimous vote against installing natural gas, also known, which is a euphemism, methane gas, in any new construction. And that scaled up to become something that will help us leave another kind of fossil fuel behind and build an all electric future that can be an all renewable future. So, we don't always have to measure people by their toil. We can measure them by their impact. And so that's partly about doing it wisely. And, and it's also feeling that you also matter and you're also what all this is for. And maybe that's where I should end. You also matter. You're also who I'm doing this for, and we're doing this for. And we deserve the best future, and we're here to make it. And I'm so grateful to be invited to be here and to invite you all to work with me and with us to make it.
Thank you so much. There's so many positive feedbacks in the chat that we'll send to you.
Thank you so much.
And for those out there listening, if you want to tune in to the rest of our events, you can find the information at climate.cooper.edu. And we'd like to thank Rebecca Solnit for her time and energy again. And with that, good night.
Good night, everybody.